Hello everyone, welcome. Today we're going to be covering my latest obsession, which is Epic the Musical, and specifically we're starting off with the hot take that I've been seeing everywhere, which is Polyphemus did nothing wrong. But before we get too far into that, we obviously have to start with a rant, so here's my brief complaint regarding modern myths. Modern reinterpretation is great so long as you remain respectful of the original message in the mythology. I should never see an example of Eurydice escaping the underworld, or Odie x Polyphemus fanfiction for that matter. Thank you, AO3. That being said, Epic the Musical does take some creative license with Homer's Odyssey, and again, I think that's great so long as we acknowledge there's now a little bit of a modern lens on that. So now let's move to Polyphemus. Now, from a personal perspective, if someone broke into my apartment and killed my cat, I would make Squid Games look like an episode of Cocomelon. That doesn't make it right, though, and in reality, this story is a metaphor for the violation of Xenia, ancient Greek hospitality laws. In this case, Odysseus fucks up first. Odysseus and his crew rob Polyphemus, and it's only in the Underworld Saga that Odie finally comes to terms with the fact that the Cyclops is trying to avenge his friends. Of course, Polyphemus should have greeted them with hospitality in the first place, but Odie also shouldn't have drugged his wine, and on and on and on. People will argue back and forth, but remember, there's one other individual in this story who comes home, finds a bunch of strangers in his house, and then proceeds to kill them. Which brings me to my main point, that every monster and obstacle that Odysseus faces is a direct reflection of Odysseus himself. Ultimately, both Polyphemus and Odysseus are shepherds who fail to protect their flock. Polyphemus lost his sheep, and Odysseus loses everyone else. The same can be said for the pride both characters showcase. Polyphemus thought himself above Zeus's laws and above Xenia, and Odysseus thought himself above Polyphemus, which is why he doxed himself and ended up in conflict with Poseidon. Final point about Polyphemus before we move on to the other obstacles that Odysseus faces. He is not a toddler. That is a completely modern take, it's one I happen to like. But Homer describes the guy as godlike, and I've never seen a child that reminded me of anything other than Satan. Now let's move on to Circe, a figure who I would argue is another warrior of the mind. Circe does not handle threats head-on. She beguiles and deceives and turns people into pigs. She's strapped with a magic wand and she's not afraid to use it. Similarly, she also describes a host of nymphs that are under her protection, people who she's failed before as well. The Underworld Saga is very on the nose. It's Odysseus coming face to face with his own failures, his dead mom, his dead men, and he meets Tiresias, the seer who was actually unnamed in the musical. Terry represents a kind of rare character that we get in the Odyssey, and that is someone who technically has more knowledge than Odysseus himself, because he's, a prophet. But unfortunately, the prophet is dead. Prophetic skill issues aside, let's move on to the Thunder Saga and the next monster we meet, Sirens, who in the original mythology are bird women. That's irrelevant to the point I'm trying to make, I'm just annoyed. The sirens are temptresses, beguilers like Circe or Odysseus himself, with holders of esoteric knowledge like Circe or Odysseus himself. They're also used to showcase the difference between knowledge and wit. Odysseus is much more clever than them and therefore able to get the information he needs. They're significantly weaker than him as well, which is why the crew could overpower them once they were onto their tricks. Finally, we get to my favorite character and my favorite song in the entire series, Scylla. I love her because of what she represents. She is just as much a victim of the gods as Odysseus is. In the mythology, Scylla was a nymph who was transformed into her hideous form by either Amphitrite, Poseidon's wife, or Circe herself. Scylla makes it very clear what she represents, claiming both she and Odysseus are just doing what it takes to survive, something he can't fault her for because he is more than happy to sacrifice 6 men if it means he can get home and see his wife. The Ithas Saga goes even further in showing how alike Scylla and Odysseus are. The suitors realize he's aiming at them by watching their torches, the same way he marked men to die when passing through Scylla's territory. And remember, back in the Underworld Saga, Odysseus swears to become the monster. Final point about Scylla, she snatches men that enter her territory in groups of 6. Normally, she'll only kill 6, but if the boat passing through is really slow, she'll take 12. Odysseus kills 108 suitors, which is a multiple of 6. So theoretically, if you took all of them, put them on a boat, and they were really bad at rowing, she could have eaten them all. Now with the mutiny and Zeus's arrival, it really just goes to show that if there's only ever going to be one winner, everyone's going to suck trying to be that one person who survives. While Eurylochus' moral basis is completely flawed in anger about 6 men dying versus the 43 men that he was willing to abandon to Circe, it doesn't change the fact that he was totally within his rights to prioritize himself. The only reason why it didn't work is because Zeus gave the choice to Odysseus. If it had gone to the crew, they absolutely would have let their captain die, and they would have done it guiltlessly. Meanwhile, if you had stabbed me, I would have drowned you myself. Finally, we get to Calypso, everyone's favorite person to hate. Calypso represents how much it sucks to have your life in the hands of another, which is ironic because it happens right after Thunderbringer. The whole point is, just as Odysseus was in charge of his men's lives until they died, she wanted control of him forever. Another fun point to make in regard to modern mythological retellings, Percy Jackson's use of Calypso, where she is trapped on her island of Ogygia, is not actually based in mythology. That was just her home, according to Homer. Now, once he goes free, he ends up encountering Charybdis, who is frankly my weakest link for this argument that all the obstacles he faces are metaphors for himself. If you'll take a moment to look at the secondary title I have for this video, we're absolutely going to go into that further. But when it comes to the analogy that can be drawn from Charybdis, a monster that swallows the ocean 3 times a day, and Odysseus, I have to assume the dude's head game was fucking crazy. Penelope waited 20 years for him. His tongue must have been prehensile, and the only way Homer could drive that shit home was by making him face a giant whirlpool. Finally, we get to Poseidon, who is a father attempting to avenge his son, something I hope you can see rings with Odysseus, especially after listening to the Ithas Saga. Now, is Poseidon still a dick? Absolutely, all the gods are. But it goes to show that a lot of the obstacles that Odysseus faces are trying to achieve the exact same thing he is looking to do. Finally, we're at the Ithas Saga. Let's start with the suitors. They are a catharsis for Odysseus. This man has spent so long feeling so guilty about how ruthless he's had to be in order to survive. And finally, 108 motherfuckers try him, and he gets to go, fuck it, we ball. The best men that Odysseus knew are dead. The most honorable ones are gone. He is what's left. Interestingly, the suitors serve as a parallel for the Trojan War. In the first war, Odysseus was the attacker, trying to break into Troy and destroy it. Here, he is the defender, and for very similar reasons. To briefly rehash the Trojan War, it started when Paris, a prince of Troy, kidnapped Helen, the wife of Menelaus and the most beautiful woman in the world. Menelaus was the king of Sparta, and per a prior agreement with the other kings and princes of Greece, they went to war to get her back. This, after spending a decade fighting for Helen and another getting home, comes to find a bunch of people horny for his wife, and it doesn't go well for them. Now the suitors have gotten got, they've been turned into various types of pincushions, and so Odysseus faces his final challenge, Penelope, convincing her that he is her husband. According to the mythology, this man was naked and covered in the blood of 100+ people and trying to holler at her. Obviously, she was a little skeptical, but it goes to show why they were so loyal to each other. They're very similar. Just as he is wily and manipulative and uses his wits to make sure he comes home, Penelope does the same thing to keep the suitors off of her until he gets back. Now, of course, we have to address my claim that people give Odysseus a lot of slack because he's attractive, and I have two main pieces of evidence. Number one is his track record. If a guy has an attractive partner, that means he's either funny or she's doing charity work. It happens very frequently. But if you have two goddesses falling in love and a woman waiting 20 years for you, I think you have to be hot. Capable at other things, but also hot. The second piece of evidence I have is the Palintonus bow, the backwards bending bow that none of the suitors could actually string. These bows apparently stored about 1.5 times the energy of a standard bow, meaning that Odysseus was absolutely ripped, and I would argue Penelope is a back girl, because those lats must have been absolutely insane. Another interesting thing I want to point out, when Penelope issues the challenge in the Ithas Saga, she refers to her husband's old bow. However, the suitors call it the old king's bow, and they keep calling him the old king, even up until Eurymachus, who begs Odysseus for his life, and still calls him that to his face. Now I'll turn to you. Did Polyphemus do anything wrong? Of course he did, but nothing that Odysseus didn't do. Unfortunately for our Cyclops, the story is called the Odyssey and not the Polyphemusy. Probably for the best. That covers it all today, guys. Thank you so much for being here. If you haven't yet, make sure you subscribe here and to my newsletter, The Valthakan Times, where we have everything you need for book recommendations, short stories, and advice. I'll see you next time.